It's a special pleasure for me and for all of my colleagues to introduce Philippe de Montebello, our 2017 Edmund Burke Award honoree. For more than 30 years, Philippe steered the Metropolitan Museum of Art through the perilous, shark-infested waters of the contemporary art world. He had manifold physical accomplishments there, essentially doubling the size of the museum. He oversaw the construction of some of the most acclaimed gallery spaces in America and made a series of stunning acquisitions for the Met's fabled collection. But Philippe is much more than an unusually able arts administrator. Unlike many museum directors, he never confused size with accomplishment. He was conspicuously a custodian of responsible growth, and moreover, ground his activity as director in high critical standards and a passionate and informed connoisseurship. All of which is to say that Philippe cares deeply about the drawn or painted or sculpted line, as well as the bottom line. Since leaving the Met in 2008, Philippe has nurtured that understanding in his many students at the Institute of Fine Arts at New York University, and through his transformative chairmanship of the Hispanic Society of America. His entire career has been a testament to a firm and sympathetic understanding of the importance of aesthetic experience in the metabolism of the good life. That understanding is one thing that linked Philippe and Hilton Kramer, the founding editor of the New Criterion, and for many years, the chief art critic of the New York Times, back when that paper cared about art as distinct from trendy, politically correct publicity. Philippe's concern for the aesthetic dimension of life is also something that links him with Edmund Burke, the Genius Loci of our proceedings tonight. And by the way, I'm happy that I was told that we have the great-grandson of Edmund Burke in our audience tonight. Many of us, when we think about Burke, think of his deep and devastating criticism of that hideous assault on civilization that we know today as the French Revolution. But before Burke was a critic of anti-civilizational radicalism, he was a champion of those values, experiences, and activities that underwrite cultural life in modern commercial society. While still in his 20s, Burke published a philosophical inquiry into the origin of our ideas of the sublime and the beautiful. Rightly regarded as a classic of 18th century social reflection, Burke's youthful investigation stressed the extent to which our experience of the beautiful arises out of and reinforces our common nature and humanity. Art was no private pursuit, but something that links us in a brotherhood of taste and judgment. Behind and supporting that brotherhood was the intergenerational continuity that liberates our individual experience from the prison of the present moment. Such continuity was a watchword throughout Burke's thought, the continuity with past generations that alone makes possible a full understanding of who we are today, and also the continuity of our experience with the experiences of our cultural heritage. An appreciation of those continuities is precisely what allows a Duccio or a Donatello, apparently so distant from our experience, to speak with such heart-rending immediacy to us over the span of centuries. Fostering that appreciation over the yammering static of our present tense culture is a large part of what the New Criterion has endeavored to do these past 35 years. In that, we have aspired to emulate the example of figures like Philippe de Montebello, who for more than 50 years now has been one of our most eloquent and inspiring ambassadors from what John Keats apostrophized as the realms of gold, the realms of high artistic achievement. I and my colleagues at the new Criterion are as grateful as we are honored to welcome Philippe here tonight to speak about art in conversation. Philippe.
Thank you very much, Roger, for these very fulsome words, very kind. And I'm glad you mentioned Hilton Kramer, and I'm glad to see that and note that your new Criterion in new hands is in as good a hands, at least, as those of my late and good friend Hilton. You basically introduced my come here as well, speaking about Edmund Burke, and I have to say that it would be very difficult in my position not to be an admirer of Edmund Burke, the child of the Enlightenment, or in a way, the father of the Enlightenment. And the Enlightenment is, of course, the mother of all museums. This is when they are ultimately born. You mentioned also, I'm glad to say, his wonderful essay on the sublime and the beautiful, which for him, who was very much of an anti-Platonic, were two irreconcilable qualities of a work of art. You could not be sublime and beautiful at the same time. Read the essay, it's absolutely fabulous. As to the title of my talk this evening, it's not a talk, it's a few remarks after very kind words on my behalf. I have to say that a few months ago, James Panero, I think it was, sent me an email saying we have to go to press tomorrow with the Save the Date was the title of your talk. Needless to say, I had absolutely no idea what my talk would be about. So I thought of a Passepartout title, one that would fit all sizes. And at the time, it reflected some of the things that I was thinking of and talking to my students at the Institute of Fine Arts about, which is art in conversation. By which I meant, of course, that as you all know, if you've looked at any work of art, that you don't do so passively, that you have a response. It can be disgust, it can be admiration, it can be delight, it can be any number of things, but it's a response, which means that it is a conversation with the work of art. And when is the last time that you ever saw a work of art by itself? Works of art are also in conversation, and they're in conversation. I'm going to drink without a glass, I think. No, it would have amused me, actually. Especially with the photographers here. And I think it's being videotaped. Well, in medias res, what was I saying? I was saying that, in fact, works of art are in conversation, of course, with themselves. No work of art, unless you're in the tokonoma, which is a special room outside the tea ceremony where work is shown alone. Works of art are in the company of other works of art. And depending on what the company it keeps, the work changes very much its meaning and how we respond to it. The conversations are fluid. The conversations can change enormously the way a placement does. If you were to change two seats at your table and switch places, the dynamics of the conversation is likely to change, and it's the same thing in a museum. Let me give you just one example, and I'll come to the crux of my talk in a moment also. If you take, for example, a constable, and you're a relatively small museum, so you are not able to have a room of 19th century or late 18th century English paintings, and you hang the constable next to a Ruysdael, 17th century Dutch landscape painter, you are sending an active message to the viewer. You're saying Constable is the man who, with brighter colors, rejecting the convention of that the browner painting by Ruysdael followed, is the man who announces modernity. The next curator comes along, takes your picture by Constable and hangs it next to a Monet, and suddenly what is the message? The old master suddenly becomes Constable. This is how these conversations ultimately change enormously. And they change also with the change of the canon. We have lived for a long, long time, hundreds of years, with a canon that was essentially based on the Apollo Belvedere, on Raphael as the nec plus ultra of all of painting. And there was a certain consistency to the way in which one approached works of art, in which curators hung and installed their galleries. Of course, the Elgin marbles, the Parthenon marbles, when they arrived, changed everything about the canon, and all of a sudden it shifted to something else. Then came in the middle of the 19th century, the Salon des Refusés, and everything went, by which I meant everything goes, but it was a past tense in the sentence. Deadly serious people are boring. So what happens is then you have contemporary art, and there's no question of a canon. You have a kind of an anarchical situation where everything from even rectangular objects with paint on it and sculpture exists, but it coexists with installation pieces, with videos, and things of that sort, very ephemeral material. And so the work and the conversation is a very different one, to the point where there is such I would call it, I guess, an obsession with contemporary art in opposition to everything else. Although the public doesn't follow, if you count the millions of people who go to museums that have no contemporary art, they are coming to see something else. But in any event, as far as contemporary art is concerned, the fashion, or maybe it's a trend, now, of course, is to insert contemporary art, not only in contemporary art museums and modern art museums, but into older museums. And you've all seen it, witnessed it, from the controversial and much criticized works of Jeff Koons being shown in Versailles, to the much more applauded Anish Kapoor sculpture in the gardens of Versailles, which created in function of Versailles, to just about every museum that includes now contemporary art, but I mean not as a department, but in contiguity with the art of the past. And I was recently at the Kunsthistorisches Museum in Vienna, and as you know, the collections stop at 1900, but they have a curator of contemporary art. He's a very bright fellow by the name of Jasper Sharp, and he actually did a wonderful exhibition a couple of years ago, which was at the time at which the great Kunstkammer, the Curiosities Salon, was opened, and it was an exhibition of Joseph Cornell boxes, which are many works of memory and basically very similar to the Kunstkammer. So there are good conversations that can be had between new and old. My point tonight, and I want to get to it right away because I don't want to last forever, is the notion that increasingly the conversation in museums is being drowned out. It's being drowned out by an awful lot of peripheral noise, rhetorically speaking, of tangential activities, and a kind of a rush to notoriety that results in a number of museums kind of going off course, the big ship tilting one way or the other, and even in terms of its policies, a privileging, if you will, of trendiness over innovation, or of amusement over nourishment. There is as well, increasingly, a frenzy of activities in museums. You've all noticed it, especially on weekends, a plethora of programs, any number of amenities, and none of these are in themselves bad. I use them joyfully, but it's the emphasis, it's the rhetorical, it's the promotional emphasis that is being played on these subsidiary activities. And one, in describing them or characterizing them, if you prefer, might actually think back to Hector's exhortation in Troilus and Cressida, where he says, "'Tis mad idolatry to place the service before the god. And my great colleague, the late Ernst Gombrich, great art historian in England, put it another way when he described all the fever of amenities around museums. He said, basically, I think that museums are killing art out of kindness. So it's a different way of putting it. But I want at this point to come to the chase and to suggest that I think one should be philosophical about all of these things, philosophical about the fact that everything is tilted to what is called the visitor experience and what is also called visitor engagement. You and I, at one point or another, looked searchingly at works of art. We now engage in works of art, and museums have engagement officers. Several of them do. I don't know whether they are bridal services, but in any event, that's what they are called. What I want to focus on at this point, on the other hand, is very serious. And it is the fact that all of the things that I mentioned that will contribute to diminishing and lessening the quality of the experience is a matter of temporality, it's circumstantial, and it isn't really on the long term that serious. What makes museums matter, art museums that is, what really counts is that the prosaic aspect of it. They are containers. What counts is that they are repositories. They are repositories, but repositories for what? For the world's cultural, tangible heritage, for the vestiges of the past or the expressions of the present. Objects of aesthetic merit. They inspire delight, they inspire wonder, but they are also objects that museums as research institutions study. And we add to the base of knowledge of mankind through these objects. So it is in the way a museum resembles, if you wish, a library, which is not only useful at the moment at which you're reading a book, that a museum is important. And it will go through bad patches, museums do around the world. You remember the V&A in the 1980s. Strategies will be put ahead of principles. There are endless surveys that museums conduct. There are marketing studies. And seemingly a lot of the time, you know, the mission appears to be put in the hands of consultants. But I don't think we should fret too much about it. And while I mention it, I don't fret too much about it because nowhere in the world, in any museums, can I say that museums have been poorly cared for, that their collections are poorly cared for. Everywhere I turn, every museum, no matter the policies of the moment, do care for their collections. They study them, they catalog them, they publish them. In other words, that tangible heritage of mankind remains absolutely safe. The pendulum will swing back. And it's what you're talking about in terms of these collections are basically the highest aspirations of mankind. I mean, now that I'm in the academy and teach, I've learned certain phraseologies. You don't get away with saying man anymore, you have to say mankind. No, you actually have to say, I was corrected, you have to say humankind, forgive me. It's humankind. In any event, and I don't mean this at all disparagingly, it's perfectly logical in a certain way, but I may sound perhaps a little bit like someone pulling out a lot of empty grandiloquence, and I don't think that is the case, and I can prove it. And I can prove it because if you analyze a little bit what has been happening in recent years, particularly in the Mideast, with ISIS destroying the treasures of Mosul, of Khorsabad, we have read in the social media, on television, don't read on television, you've seen and you've read in the newspapers, and millions, tens of millions of people have expressed their outrage at what has happened. These tens of millions of people probably had very little notion earlier of what ancient Mesopotamian art was. But I think they understood that worldwide what had happened is that on mankind's cultural family tree, a huge limb had been hacked off. It was instinctively understood, an understanding of a civilization for which they had no specific knowledge, but an instinctive understanding. And worldwide, you had that lament. And the fact is, in the rooms of our museums, we have the branches of that cultural family tree. And I think we should value, more than anything else, we being the museum world, what we are. There is far too much emphasis, in my view, on what we do, on all of the activities, which is why I am optimistic and about the future of that world, optimistic that the conversations that we have with works of art that are being lost in the din of the noise of many activities will enable us over time, when the right atmosphere for the appreciation, the experience of art is provided, we can have that ultimate conversation we all want to have, which is the sublime private colloquy with the work of art. And it's the conversation that we seek, the one that is singular and provide a singularity of experience. I have no more voice, so I stop. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Philippe.